Today we will talk about westward migration and we will start our lecture with the concept of manifest destiny.
In the middle of the 19th century, farmers in the Old West, the land across the Allegheny Mountains in Pennsylvania, began to hear about the opportunities to be found in the New West. They had long believed that the land west of the Mississippi was a great desert, unfit for human habitation. But now, the federal government was encouraging them to join the migratory stream westward to this unknown land. For a variety of reasons, Americans increasingly felt compelled to fulfill their manifest destiny, a phrase that came to mean that they were expected to spread across the land given to them by God and, most importantly, spread predominantly American values to the frontier. With great trepidation, hundreds and then hundreds of thousands of settlers packed their lives into wagons and set out following the Oregon, California, and Santa Fe trails to seek a new life in the West. They imagined open lands, economic opportunity, and greater freedom to fulfill the democratic vision originally promoted by Thomas Jefferson, despite Native American communities living in the region. To assist the settlers in their move westward and transform the migration from a trickle into a steady flow, Congress passed two significant pieces of legislation in 1862. Those were the Homestead Act and the Pacific Railway Act. Now let's start with the Homestead Act of 1862. From early colonial days, the desire for free land had generated successive waves of westward migrations. By the 1850s, prominent individuals such as New York Tribune editor Horace Grindley and organizations such as the Free Soil Party and labor unions were urging enactment of homestead legislation. Homesteading was contentious because Northerners and Republicans wanted to free up large plots of land to settlement by individual farmers, while Southern Democrats sought to make the lands of the West available only to slave owners. In 1860, Congress finally passed a Homestead Act, but Democratic President James Buchanan vetoed it. Southerners opposed the act on the grounds that it would result in anti-slavery people settling the territories. The Republican Party platform for the 1860 election promised a new homestead bill. After Congress was emptied of Southern slaveholding legislatures just before the Civil War started, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Homestead Act of 1862. The Homestead Act allowed any head of household or individual over the age of 21, including unmarried women, to receive a parcel of 160 acres for only a nominal filing fee. All that recipients were required to do in exchange was to improve the land within a period of 5 years of taking possession. The standards for improvement were minimal. Owners could clear a few acres, build small houses or barns, or maintain livestock. Under this act, the government transferred over 270 million acres of public domain land to private citizens. Most importantly, the applicant must never bear arms against the United States government or give an aid and comfort to its enemies. After the Civil War, this meant that ex-Confederate soldiers were ineligible to apply for a homestead. With the passage of 14th Amendment, which guaranteed U.S. citizenship to African American and ex-slaves, homesteading became a possibility for freed people. From 1862 to 1934, the federal government granted over 1.5 million homesteads to private citizens. This represented approximately 10% of entire landmass of the United States.
The Pacific Railroad Act, passed by Congress in 1862, authorized the construction of the first transcontinental railway line connecting the East and the West coasts. The need for a transcontinental railway to facilitate the transportation of persons and products across the United States became increasingly clear in the 1850s due to the acquisition of California and the resolution of the Oregon boundary dispute. In 1862, before the secession of South from the Union, the Republican Party in Congress was instrumental in enacting legislation that authorized the Union Pacific Railway and the Central Pacific Railroad to construct such a railway. The Union Pacific Railway was to begin construction at Omaha, Nebraska, with the objective of connecting with the Central Pacific Railroad, which was to begin construction at the same time in Sacramento, California. The law provided that after each railroad laid 40 miles of track, it was to receive 6,400 acres of public lands and government loans ranging from $16,000 to $48,000 per mile of track completed. Congress passed additional legislation in 1864 to provide more land and money to complete the project.
Now let's talk about who migrated to the West. Firstly, there were African Americans. As Jim Crow segregation became entrenched in the South during the Reconstruction, racial violence and the pervasive repression of the African Americans created a hostile environment. After the Compromise of 1877 that removed federal protection for African Americans in the South, it became clear that anyone who attempted to resist racial oppression would be subjected to severe harassment. Now, what was the Compromise of 1877? The Compromise of 1877 was an informal agreement between Northern Republicans and the Southern Democrats. The election of 1876 between Democratic candidate Samuel Tilden and Republican candidate Rutherford Hayes was heavily disputed, and lawmakers had to compromise to find a solution. The Southern Democrats agreed to allow Republican Rutherford Hayes to win the presidency in exchange for the removal of troops from the South and the end of Northern enforcement of Reconstruction-era legislation. The Compromise of 1877 essentially ended the Reconstruction era. As a result, African Americans migrated to the West to escape the racism and also to find new economic opportunities. These migrants, most of them were former slaves, they became known as Exodusters, a name which took inspiration from the biblical Exodus, during which Moses led the Hebrews out of slavery in Egypt and into the Promised Land. The Exodusters settled in the states of Colorado, Kansas, and Oklahoma. Kansas was seen as a particularly promising land of opportunity because it had fought hard for its status as a free state. By 1890, over 500,000 black people lived west of the river Mississippi. Although the majority of black migrants became farmers, approximately 12,000 worked as cowboys during the Texas cattle drives. Some also became buffalo soldiers in the wars against Native Americans. Now let's talk about the European immigrants. Germans, Scandinavians, and Irish were among the most common. These ethnic groups tended to settle close together, creating strong rural communities that mirrored the way of life they had left behind. According to the US Census Bureau records, the number of Scandinavians living in the United States during the second half of the 19th century exploded from barely 18,000 in 1850 to over a million in 1900. During the same time period, the German and Irish-born population in the United States grew substantially. As they moved westward, several thousand immigrants established homestays in the Midwest, primarily in Minnesota and Wisconsin, where, as of 1900, over one-third of the population was foreign-born, and in North Dakota, whose immigrant population stood at 45% at the turn of the century. Now let's move on to the Hispanic population. Several hundred thousand Hispanics had already settled in the American Southwest prior to the US government seizing the land during its war with Mexico. The Treaty of Guadalupe, which ended the war in 1848, granted American citizenship to those who chose to stay in the United States as the land switched from Mexicans to the US ownership. Under the conditions of the treaty, Mexicans retained the right to their language, religion, and culture, as well as the property they held. As for citizenship, they could choose one of the three options. Firstly, declare their intent to live in the United States but retain Mexican citizenship. Secondly, become US citizens with all rights under the Constitution. Or thirdly, leave for Mexico. Despite such guarantees, within one generation, these new Hispanic American citizens found their culture under attack and legal protection of their property all but non-existent. Another group was the Chinese. Although the Chinese are remembered in American history primarily for their role in building the Transcontinental Railroad, their importance in the West extended far beyond that single event.
Chinese immigrants who came to work on the railroad, mines, and fields were part of a Chinese global diaspora, which sold contract Chinese laborers and Chinese women as indentured laborers and sex workers who lived little better than slaves. From 1840s to 1870s, Chinese immigrants, free and contracted, moved to Australia, Southeast Asia, Peru, Cuba, and California. Those who migrated left sparse opportunities, a rigid class system, and grinding poverty in 19th century southern China. Starting in 1870, however, anti-Chinese sentiments increased as Western economy gained importance. In a pattern that repeated throughout 20th century, communities and industries built by the cheapest foreign labor turned against those workers as soon as labor needs diminished. Urged by white labor organizers, anti-Chinese leagues, and community leaders, Western states passed laws limiting Chinese opportunities and rights throughout the 1870s. State laws and political enthusiasm promoted the US Congress to pass the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. This act, which nominally suspended immigration, was renewed and tightened over the years until harsh immigration restrictions enacted in the early 1920s ended virtually all Asian immigration to the United States. In addition, several Western states passed laws restricting Chinese and later Japanese land ownership and barred them from several professions. As a consequence of these restrictions, immigration from Mexico rose to meet the need for cheap labor in the California field. Now let's move on to the everyday life. The daily life of people living on the frontier was filled with hard work and difficulties. Once a farmer cleared the land, built a cabin and a barn, and planted his crops, he still had a lot of chores that needed to be done each day. In order to survive, the entire family needed to work. Each day, the settlers would wake up with the sunlight and work until sundown. As settlers and homesteaders moved westward to improve the land given to them through the Homestead Act, they faced significant difficulty. The land was difficult to farm, there were few building materials, and harsh weather, insects, and inexperience led to frequent setbacks. The prohibitive prices charged by the fast railroad lines made it expensive to ship crops to market or have goods sent out. One of the first things a farmer needed to do was to build a barn and a cabin. The barn was important to keep the animals safe from wolves and other predators, and also to store farming tools and grain. Typically, the barn and the cabin were made from logs in a fashion that didn't need any nails. A few unseasonably rainy years had led would-be settlers to believe that the Great Desert was no more, but the region's typically low rainfall and harsh temperatures made crop cultivation hard. Irrigation was a requirement, but finding water and building adequate systems proved too difficult and expensive for many farmers. It was not until 1902 and the passage of the New Lands Reclamation Act that a system finally existed to set aside funds from the sale of public lands to build dams for subsequent irrigation efforts. Prior to that, farmers across the Great Plains relied primarily on dry farming techniques to grow corn, wheat, etc., a practice that many continued in the later years. A few also began to employ windmill technology to draw water, although both the drilling and construction of windmills became an added expense that a few farmers could afford. Now let's move on to economic difficulties. While the land was essentially free under the Homestead Act, all other farm necessities cost money and were initially difficult to obtain in the newly settled parts of the country where market economics did not yet fully reach. Horses, livestock, wagons, wells, fencing, seed, and fertilizers were all critical to survival, but often hard to come by as the population initially remained sparsely settled across vast tracts of land. Railroads charged notoriously high rates for farm equipment and livestock, making it difficult to procure goods or make a profit on anything sent back east. Banks also charged high interest rates, and in a cycle that replayed itself year after year, farmers would borrow from the bank with the intention of repaying their debt after the harvest. As the number of farmers moving westward increased, the market price of their produce steadily declined, even as the value of the actual land increased. Each year, hardworking farmers produced ever larger crops, flooding the markets and subsequently driving prices down even further. Although some understood the economics of supply and demand, none could overtly control such forces. Additionally, farmers also found themselves contending with unfavorable government policies and unchecked corporate monopolies. Railroad monopolies charged shipping rates so high that in some cases it was cheaper for the farmer to burn their crops for fuel than to ship them to market. Farm machinery and fertilizers were also subject to steep markups. All of these factors combined to drive farmers into debt and bankruptcy. Frustration with these circumstances led farmers to band together in cooperative organization. The Order of Patron of Husbandry, commonly called the Grange, formed in 1867. The Grange called for increased railroad regulations and cooperative buying and selling of equipment and produce. At its height, the Grange had more than 700,000 members, mainly in the upper Midwest states of Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. In the late 1870s, an even larger organization, the Farmers Alliance, spread among the southern and western farmers. The Farmers Alliance established exchanges that would issue loans to farmers and sell their crops and proposed that the federal government loan money to farmers at low interest rates and create warehouses to store their crops. By 1890, the Farmers Alliance had more than 3 million members. Strictly segregated, the alliance did not accept African American farmers into its rank. They created a separate Colored Farmers Alliance with more than 1 million members. Now we will talk about the condition of women. Women had their jobs and worked hard too. In many cases, they helped the farmer in the fields during planting and harvesting times. Women faced all the physical hardship that men encountered in terms of weather, illness, and danger, with the added complication of childbirth. Often, there was no doctor or midwife providing assistance, and many women died from treatable complications, as did their newborns. While some women could find employment in the newly settled towns as teachers and cooks, they originally did not enjoy many rights. They could not sell property, sue for divorce, serve on juries, or vote. And for the vast majority of women, their work was not in towns for money but on the farm. As late as 1900, a typical farm wife could expect to devote 9 hours per day to chores such as cleaning, sewing, laundering, and preparing food. Despite this grim image, the challenges of farm life eventually empowered women to break through some legal and social barriers. Many lived more equitably as partners with their husband than did their Eastern counterparts, helping each other through both hard times and good. If widowed, a wife typically took over responsibility for the farm, a level of management that was very rare back east, where the farm would fall to a son or other male relation. Pioneer women made important decisions and were considered by their husbands to be more equal partners in the success of the homestead due to the necessity that all members had to work hard and contribute to the farming enterprise for it to succeed. These women began to organize churches, schools, civic clubs, and other community programs to promote family values. They fought to remove opportunities for prostitution and all other vices that they felt threatened the values that they held dear. Protestant missionaries eventually joined the women in their efforts, and while they were not widely successful, they did bring greater attention to the problems.